Davos Seaworth had never asked for a crown. By the time he found himself at the heart of the realm's darkest hour, the calloused hands that once handled smuggled onions and fish on the Blackwater Bay had also handled swords, heartbreak, and truths far heavier than he could have imagined in his youth. Snow flecked his black hair, now going gray, an unassuming badge of winter's slow arrival, and his tired eyes surveyed the city that had once spurned him. Now, from every shadowed alley of Flea Bottom to the high towers of the Red Keep, the people whispered his name with a reverence never before granted him. He was born a common man of the narrow sea, molded by salt and hardship, a smuggler who had survived impossible storms. Yet here they stood, hundreds, no thousands, of small folk in the streets. Children, faces smeared with soot, brandished wooden spoons like scepters. Fishermen, reeking of the sea, pressed their thick, rough palms over their hearts. Mothers and wives, in cloaks too thin for the biting wind, stared with tear-filled eyes. They all called out in unison when they saw him step through the tall gates of the Red Keep. Davos! Long live Davos! It was madness. A dream, perhaps. But no, the cold wind that knifed through his bones was real. The trembling in his hands was real. The memory of Stannis Baratheon, his grim-faced king, burned bright in his thoughts. Stannis had believed in duty, unwavering and stern, and Davos had followed him all his life, or so it seemed. But kings and lords had failed the people time and again, and the realm was near ruin. The small folk had endured war after war, a dance of dragons and lions and wolves that left them hungry and cold. In the confusion of collapsing alliances and broken lines of succession, the people raised their hands to Davos, the low-born smuggler knight, the one they believed could unite them. He tried to quell their calls, tried to hush them, but a swelling tide of devotion spilled down the cobbled roads. Even the gold cloaks, so often tools of oppression and fear, now stood aside meekly, either awestruck or too uncertain of whose order they should follow in this new world. Davos's heart hammered like a drum in his chest. For so long, he had carried out the duties others demanded of him. He had served Stannis, then the living. He had served as hand, advisor, negotiator. That was enough. He did not crave this new station. He believed with every fiber of his being that no man born in the darkness of Flea Bottom should sit on the Iron Throne. But the city's cry told him the old ways were drowned, and a new tide was coming in. The Iron Throne had seen the scorched remains of those who insisted upon their right to sit it. It had seen the betrayals that ended families. It had seen great treacheries and monstrous cruelty. But now it seemed to beckon someone else. A man who had tasted the bitterness of the realm's disregard and yet had never forgotten the people he was once a part of. In that moment, standing before a crowd of desperate eyes shining with hope, Davos Seaworth felt the weight of 1,000 lifetimes pressing upon him, demanding he bear them into a better future. Ser Davos, a woman whispered from behind him. It was a sister of the faith, clad in robes of undyed wool. She stared up at him as if looking for some sign of the divine. The small folk wait on your word. He blinked. How could he speak for the realm when his tongue felt thick in his mouth, when his knees threatened to buckle beneath him from the enormity of it? Yet the compassion in the watchers' faces and the desperation in their voices pushed him forward. He cleared his throat, swallowing his fear. My friends, he began, you know me, Davos Seaworth. I was born among you, his voice cracked. I never dreamed of this. He trailed off, unsure how to continue. A hush fell across the plaza, so quiet that he could hear the faint clatter of banners against the castle walls. Even the wind seemed to pause as though waiting for him to speak. A child perched on her father's shoulders, eyes shining, looked at him with pure, unguarded hope. Davos's heart twisted. I am no prince, Davos said finally, his voice low. I am no lord. I have been hand to a king, but I was born with nothing but my wits and a boat. I do not want power. I have seen what it does to the good and the proud, and I know how it destroys. But you, if you truly call upon me, then I will answer. Not for glory, but for duty. Not for ambition, but because I love this realm and her people. If you will have me, I promise to serve you as best I can for as long as I can stand. He paused, the magnitude of this vow roaring in his ears. What a madness it was. What a sweet, impossible madness. Yet the crowd answered with a sound like thunder, a hurricane of cheers that shook him to his core. They bellowed his name, they wept, they cried out that finally the realm would have a king who knew their sorrows. Before him stood the battered gates that led into the Red Keep's courtyard. Long had men fought and died to enter those gates in triumph, each proclaiming his right to rule. Davos looked upon the cold, unyielding walls of the fortress and thought of all the secrets they held, all the cruelty they had sheltered. Now it was to be his new prison, in a sense. Yet also, perhaps, it could be the hearth from which a new warmth might spread across the land. He turned back to the crowd. I can't promise victory. I can't promise wealth or comfort. But I promise fairness. I promise to listen. I promise a chance at justice and peace. The roar was deafening. And so, with leaden steps, Davos Seaworth walked through the gate. Inside the courtyard, the hush returned. A ring of knights and guards, unsure whether to bow or stand at attention, parted to let him through. Davos caught sight of men with ragged beards and worn leathers, perhaps loyalists to a lost cause or fresh recruits to the city watch. They studied him with wide eyes, seeing in him a man who had survived the storms of the world. He supposed that was something worth noticing. He ascended the steps and entered the keep itself, a place of labyrinthine corridors and dank halls, once well lit with torches but now with half the sconces unlit, plunging corners into gloom. War had left its scars on every hallway, scorched stone, broken tapestries, shattered suits of armor. Servants and functionaries lingered in the shadows, uncertain whether to greet him. Even after the people had cried out for Davos, the corridors of power remained locked in old traditions of fear. Davos felt a trembling hand on his shoulder. He turned to see a figure he recognized, Brienne of Tarth, tall and solemn, her armor pitted from many battles. Sir Davos, she said. They're calling you your grace now, you know. His lips parted in a tired, wry grin. I prefer Davos. It's the name I've carried my whole life. Brienne inclined her head. I suspect they will insist, but I will do as you ask for now. He noticed the wounds on her face, faint scars from battles long past. She was not the only one so marked. All those who survived the wars of kings carried them in some way. Together, they walked deeper into the keep. The throne room's doors stood tall before them, carved metal reflecting the flickering torchlight. Davos took in a breath, bracing himself. This was a place that had swallowed men far more powerful than he. If he chose to walk in now, everything changed. But the small folks' chants still echoed in his head, the single cry from thousands of throats, a call for a common man to be their shield. He placed his palm on the door. It was cold. With a push, he entered, followed by Brienne and several others who had gathered around him. The throne room was quiet. Sunlight, filtered by stained glass, cast colored shards upon the floor. And there, looming at the far end, was the Iron Throne, 1,000 swords hammered into a twisted mass of metal, each blade once belonging to a man who bent the knee or died. It looked as if the throne itself might awaken to devour whomever dared sit upon it. Davos let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He approached the dais with measured steps, each footfall echoing in the cavernous space. The hush, the waiting eyes, the ghosts of all who had sat there before, Aegon, Maegor, the Targaryens, the Baratheons, the Lannisters, seemed to stir in the air. Now, a smuggler from Flea Bottom stood in that very hall, heartsick and worn, chosen by the people's love and desperation. At the foot of the dais, he paused. I'll not sit there, he said quietly, turning to Brienne. At least not yet. If the people wish me to be king, I'll do it, but not by draping myself in the trappings of power without thought. Brienne's stern gaze softened. Then what do you intend to do, Davos? He let his hand brush against the cold metal of the throne's base. I intend to gather the people who remain. Lords, ladies, small folk, the faith. The cell's words turned city watch. I'll not wear a crown until I've spoken to them all. The last thing we need is another king who rules by force alone. Brienne nodded. Then I will stand by you. Davos offered a faint smile. I appreciate it, my lady. More than you know. I suspect we'll need every steadfast soul we can find. She left to summon what few dignitaries lingered in King's Landing. The city had been starved, battered, left uncertain who would next rule. Some lords had fled to their holdfasts. Others had died in the wars or in their prisons. The Red Keep was a husk of its former might, a reflection of the realm itself. Fractured and weary, Davos found himself alone for a moment in that grand hall. The hush pressed in on him. He placed a hand upon the pommel of the sword at his belt. It was not a king's sword, not some Valyrian steel heirloom. It was a simple blade that had belonged to a soldier he once knew, a man who had fallen defending the gates. Davos had picked it up and carried it since that day, to remember the cost of war. He closed his eyes and let his mind drift to the memory of his wife and children. to their small home by the sea now gone. He remembered each child he had lost, each friend, each comrade. Would they be proud to see him standing here? Or would they tell him to run, to flee this crippling burden? He remembered Stannis, somber and unyielding, and in that memory, he found a measure of steel for his own resolve. Outside, through the high windows, the city's roar rose again, a wave of voices chanting for him. Davos realized he had no choice. The realm needed someone who would put the people first. He had no illusions about his ability to rule as the lords did, through cunning alliances and fear. His was a loyalty born of shared suffering, of quiet empathy. If that was not enough to hold the realm together, then no crown could be. When the lords and ladies, those who had remained, entered the throne room, their faces showed the shock of the times. A few proud men bristled at the sight of Davos standing near the throne. But the city's fervor had not escaped their ears, and they approached with caution. A tall, gaunt man with thinning hair took the lead. Ser Joffrey Cask, a lesser knight from the Crownlands. He bowed stiffly. "Ser Davos," he said, clearing his throat, "we hear unusual tidings, that you intend to take the throne." He tried to keep skepticism out of his voice, but fear shone in his eyes. He had seen too many unexpected outcomes these past years to gamble unwisely now. Davos dipped his head in acknowledgement. "It seems the people wish it. I never claimed I was the rightful heir to anything, but the realm is in crisis. Someone must rule, and the small folk are placing their hope in me. I mean to guide them as best I can." A ripple of murmurs swept through the assembly. Some sniffed indignantly, some gazed at Davos with wary interest, and others looked to the floor as though they had no answers of their own. A woman with sharp features and a subtle scar running down her neck stepped forward. Lady Adeline of Rosby, one of the few local nobles left. "The realm cannot be ruled merely by the will of the small folk," she said, though her tone was not unkind. "We have ancient traditions, noble houses, and alliances that must be considered. We cannot simply crown a smuggler because the city clamors for it." Davos regarded her calmly. "I know full well the power of noble houses, my lady. For too long I have watched them wage war while the small folk suffer. Let me be clear, if the noble houses have someone they can all stand behind, I won't oppose them. But I warn you, the realm is weary of lords' games. They want a king who will see them as more than fodder for ambition." Lady Adeline pursed her lips. "I cannot deny the truth in that." She glanced around at the anxious faces. "But the realm is vast, and the Targaryen threat, if any remain, is unknown. The Iron Islands simmer with rebellion. The North is all but independent. How do you propose to hold it all together?" Davos exhaled slowly. "Through trust, my lady, and honest dealings. Not by fear or the threat of dragons, but by forging something new, a realm where the lords and lowborn alike know they are governed fairly. Where taxes aren't squeezed from starving peasants to fund wars in distant lands. Where the king's word is as plain as daylight. That is what I offer." He saw some of them glance at one another. Uncertainty danced in their eyes, but beneath it there was a flicker of hope. They had survived the reigns of tyrants and mad queens. Perhaps something humble was exactly what they craved if it could survive. Brienne cleared her throat. "If we can gather the major houses who remain loyal to King's Landing, we can hold a great council. Let them decide if Ser Davos's claim has merit. Let them speak for their bannermen and smallfolk." The suggestion was met with nods. A great council, or something akin to it, had been used before in times of succession crisis. It was less about rightful bloodlines and more about consensus. Davos had no illusions that all the great lords would bend the knee. Many would scorn him. Some would sense weakness. But perhaps enough would see reason or fear the city's wrath to elevate him. "That would be acceptable," Lady Adeline said. "But until then, I trust the city watch and those who remain loyal to the crown to keep order." Davos spread his hands. "They are few and underpaid. I plan to rectify that if I can. In the meantime, I ask your cooperation. If I find any man or woman abusing the small folk or inciting violence, I will not hesitate to impose justice. We've seen enough cruelty." A slight hush followed his words, for they were aimed not only at the streets but also at any noble who might have grown used to indulgences. In the days that followed, King's Landing buzzed with nervous anticipation. Davos, for his part, did not hide himself behind locked doors. He walked among the people accompanied by a handful of loyal guards and knights, Brienne at times, and even a few wily advisors who had survived countless regime changes. The city was battered, burned buildings, plague and hunger, a chill wind that cut through threadbare garments. Every face he saw was thin, every eye hollow with longing. The nights brought freezing winds, the days were short and gray. It was no wonder the people needed someone to believe in. Whenever Davos ventured into Flea Bottom, the district that had once been his whole world, he was greeted not with scorn for his humble birth, but with cheers and desperate pleas. Men with missing limbs, survivors of war, asked for bread and work. Women caring for too many children asked for shelter. Priests of the faith distributed what food they could, but it was never enough. The city required resources from the countryside, from lords who still had means to harvest or import grain. That meant forging alliances. One morning, Davos rose before the sun. Sleep was elusive, his mind too full of worry. He donned his plain leather cloak, pinned not with any sigil of a proud house, but with a simple onion badge. For a moment, he smiled, recalling how King Stannis had once mocked that badge, yet come to respect it. Then he made his way down the corridors. He passed a few yawning guards who snapped to attention at his approach. Many still did not know how to address him, Ser Davos or Your Grace. He let them choose, but they always looked uneasy no matter which they said. He found Brienne in the courtyard, tending to her horse, a sturdy mare with a thick winter coat. "You're leaving?" he asked, the words echoing in the crisp morning air. Brienne nodded, her expression serious. "I ride to the lords of the Stormlands. I'll speak to them, ask them to send delegates to the Great Council. We need them, Davos. They have food, they have men." Davos nodded. "Will they receive you? House Tarth has some standing, but many lords might still bristle at my name." She shrugged. They might not. But I have to try. We can't rule the city by ourselves. The Stormlords once followed Stannis, grudgingly, perhaps. They might heed me now." He put a hand on her armored forearm. "Thank you, Brienne. No matter how this ends, I'm grateful." She ducked her head, a flicker of warmth in her eyes. "You gave me your trust. Now I return it." She mounted her horse and clattered out of the courtyard with a small escort. Davos watched her go, feeling guilt that so much depended on the goodwill of men who had never truly cared for the small folk. Could a single show of sincerity turn them? Perhaps not, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Davos spent his days in what had once been the small council chambers, now a makeshift council indeed. A handful of lesser lords, the High Septon's representative, a few maesters, Bronn, formerly a Sellsword, now castellan of the city's remains, and anyone else who might help rebuild the realm. They formed a patchwork alliance of men and women who never thought they'd shape the future of the Seven Kingdoms. Talks were tense. Food supplies were the main crisis. Armies had roamed the Crownlands and stripped them bare. Winter's Reach was growing. Even if the Stormlands or the Reach could spare grain, transporting it was fraught with danger, bandits roamed the roads, and no one had the coin to keep them policed. The city had little left in its coffers. At one meeting, Davos rubbed the bridge of his nose to banish a throbbing headache. "We have to restore trade," he said. "Get the port running again. It's our only hope of feeding King's Landing." A grizzled old captain of the city's meager fleet nodded. "But we need ships to protect merchant vessels from pirates. The royal fleet rots in the harbor." Davos set his jaw. "We'll scrape together what we can. Let's repair a few ships. There are men in the city who remember how to craft sails. If we can show the merchants that we have enough might to defend their cargo, they might return." Bronn snorted. "Might, though they'll want payment. Merchants don't sail into war-torn cities out of charity." Davos eyed the rough Sellsword. For all his faults, Bronn was cunning, with a certain pragmatic loyalty if he was convinced it would serve him. "They'll come if they see opportunity for profit," Davos said. "We'll waive docking fees for the first months, offer them incentives. We can raise coin once the city is stable. We have to show them we're serious about rebuilding." "It's a gamble," Bronn said, leaning back. "But so is everything these days." The High Septon's representative, an older man with a kindly face, piped up, "We might reach out to Essos. The free cities may be more than willing to sell grain if we can guarantee safe passage." Davos agreed. "I've dealt with the free cities before. I'll send envoys as soon as I can." They went on like that for hours, discussing every angle. There was no easy solution, but the council seemed spurred on by the knowledge that each day they delayed, more of the city's poor starved. Davos carried that burden like a knife in his ribs. The next challenge was defense. King's Landing's walls were battered, gates sundered, and many skilled men had died in the wars. If outside forces, rebellious lords or raiders, attacked, the city would not stand long. The city watch was undermanned, and many were incompetent or corrupt. Davos ordered a thorough purge of those who preyed on small folk, but that left fewer watchmen on the streets. Despite the long odds, an ember of hope glowed in the city. Davos walked the markets, listened to the tradesmen, and offered whatever encouragement he could. He ensured bread and fish were distributed to the poorest, small gestures but better than letting them starve. The chants of Davos, Davos, followed him any time he appeared, each cry deepening his sense of responsibility. Weeks passed, winter's chill intensified, and a dusting of snow sometimes fell on the rooftops. A gray haze of hearth smoke cloaked the city. The Red Keep's halls were cold. Davos insisted they burn no more firewood than the rest of the city. He would not feast in warmth while the people froze. Finally, word arrived from the Stormlands. Brienne returned, cheeks windburned but eyes bright with news. She strode into the council chamber where Davos was reviewing the day's decrees. Others rose at her entrance. "My lady," Davos greeted her. "Did they receive you kindly?" "As kindly as lords can," Brienne said, unbuckling her sword belt. "Many are wary, unsure if this is just a passing fancy of the mob. But some remember your service to King Stannis. They'll at least listen. A small retinue of envoys is on its way for the Great Council, and they're bringing some supplies as a gesture of goodwill." A start. Davos's shoulders relaxed a fraction. "That's more than I'd hoped. The Stormlands are battered as well. But if they stand with us, it will help." Brienne nodded. "They're not the only ones." Word's spreading. A few Reach lords are rumored to be on the move, forming a new alliance among themselves, and they want to see if King's Landing can be stabilized. Davos chewed on that. The Reach, the breadbasket of Westeros, was crucial. "We'll meet them with respect. They need to see we're not about subjugating them. We're about rebuilding." In the following days, envoys and minor lords began to trickle into the city, the battered gates opened to receive them. Each was cautious, unsure if Davos's seat would last or if another war brewed. Davos welcomed them with warmth. A simple meal, a seat by the hearth, a chance to speak plainly. Hours of talk followed. Some demanded gold or titles for their aid. Davos gritted his teeth but obliged where possible, knowing power must be shared. Yet he refused oppressive demands that would further burden the small folk. Each refusal risked alienating a potential ally, but Davos's conscience forbade cruelty. At last, the day of the Great Council arrived. It was a rare sunny morning, the sky a crisp blue, the snow on the ramparts glimmering. Banners of gold, green, red, and blue fluttered, some tattered by war, some newly sewn. Dozens of lords and their retinues gathered in the throne room, hastily restored with fresh torches and straw carpeting against the cold. The Iron Throne loomed at the far end, untouched. Davos stood before it, wearing modest finery that marked him as a leader but did not gild him like a king from the storybooks. His short gray beard was trimmed, his hair combed, but he was still the weathered sailor he'd always been. Brienne stood at his side, along with the High Septon's representative and a few others. The lords formed a semicircle facing him, some of them prominent, others heads of small houses that had survived by luck or cunning. An older lord with iron-gray hair stepped forward, Lord Valerion, once allied with Stannis. He studied Davos with sharp, calculating eyes. "Ser Davos Seaworth," he said, his voice echoing. "We come to judge your claim. The city's small folk cry out that you are their king. The realm has known kings chosen by blood and conquest, not by popular will. Yet these are strange times. Why should we bend the knee to you?" A murmur swept through the gathering. Some lords nodded as though to say, "Indeed, we need an explanation." Davos glanced around. He saw fear, defiance, but also sparks of hope. He drew a steadying breath, recalling the night he'd stood on the parapets, marveling at how impossible this all was. "My lords," he began, "I've never claimed to be rightful heir by blood. I have no noble lineage. I was born in Flea Bottom, served under King Stannis, and strove to uphold honor and justice to the best of my ability. I stand here now because the people called me. They tire of wars ignited by dynastic feuds. They tire of kings who see them as fodder. The realm is in chaos, and someone must bind it. Not with fear, but with fairness. Fairness, a lord scoffed. The realm cannot be held by fairness alone. It requires armies, alliances, power. Davos conceded with a dip of his head. True enough. To keep peace, we need strength and alliances. But we do not need to repeat the cycle of cruelty. I have no illusions. Yet I believe we can forge a new compact. The crown will stand to keep the peace, not to subjugate the land. We can share power, rule with justice instead of terror. That is what I offer. Lord Valerion's gaze was inscrutable. You speak of forging a new realm, but do we throw away centuries of tradition? Do great houses just yield their place? No, Davos said. They remain integral to Westeros. But let them no longer sow chaos in the name of ambition. Let us create a council of lords, each responsible for their region, to advise the crown. Let the small folk's voice be heard through representatives too. A new system, one that recognizes the realm does not belong to a single family. A hush followed. Some lords looked ready to protest, others exchanged thoughtful glances. They had survived unimaginable horrors. Perhaps radical measures were needed. Lord Penrose from the Stormlands cleared his throat. You say you represent the small folk, but can you feed them? Can you keep peace if the Iron Islands raid our shores, or if Dorne declares independence? Davos sighed inwardly. Alone I can't. With you, we can. The crown needs the Stormlands' steel, the Reach's grain, the Vale's knights, the Westerland's gold, the North's honor. In return, I offer a reign that doesn't bleed the realm for petty wars, that focuses on rebuilding and defending our shores. If we stand together, we survive. Apart, we fall. Lord Penrose stroked his chin, eyeing the room. We've lost so much. Very well. My men and I came with open minds. If the Stormlands can count on fair trade and no undue tax, we might support this arrangement. Others began voicing concerns, the Vale wanting safe passages, the Westerlands wanting their mines left untouched, the Riverlands needing protection from bandits. Davos pledged cooperation. He promised not to overshadow regional lords who governed justly. He would serve as a unifying figure with power to prevent wars but not the desire to seize lands. Finally, the High Septon's representative stepped forward. The faith stands for the people's well-being. We ask only that you uphold the gods' justice and protect the faithful. Do you swear to protect the faith? Davos nodded. I swear it, but I won't persecute those of different beliefs. The Red God, the old gods, I won't see more violence done in the name of faith if I can stop it. The Septon seemed faintly scandalized but resigned. Bold words, Your Grace. We accept your promise of tolerance. And so, with many arguments, bargains, and hopes laid bare, the Great Council inched toward a consensus. Lords who once scoffed at the idea of a smuggler king found themselves nodding reluctantly, moved by Davos's plain honesty, by his willingness to share power, and by the fervor of the small folk. Perhaps enough had died to make them want something new. At dusk, the final question rang out: would they accept Davos Seaworth as king under the terms laid out? One by one, the lords gave their assent, some eager, some reluctant, but unwilling to stand against both the people and a gathering consensus. Lord Valerion approached with a simple iron circlet. It was not the ornate crown of the Targaryens, nor the stag-crowned helm of House Baratheon. It was a humble circlet, perhaps hammered by a local smith anticipating this moment. He offered it to Davos. We, the assembled lords, declare you king of the 7 kingdoms, what remains of them, by the will of the council and the people. Will you accept this crown and swear to rule justly? Davos's hands shook as he took the circlet. The metal felt heavy and cold. He looked around the throne room where torches cast dancing shadows on the walls. His gaze found the common folk who had crept in to witness this historic moment. Their tearful smiles lit the hall brighter than any torch. He closed his eyes, remembering the stench of onion-laden boats, the fear of being caught as a smuggler, the bittersweet days by the sea. Now he was about to become king. I accept, he said quietly, lifting the crown. I swear to serve the realm, to uphold justice, and to put the people's welfare above my own. May the gods old and new help me keep this oath. He placed the crown upon his head. A cheer erupted, from the commoners first, then the lords. It was hesitant from some, but it grew as they realized they once again had a king. Brienne's lips quirked with a rare smile. The Septon stepped forward to bless him, words Davos barely heard over the roar of his own heartbeat. With the circlet resting uneasily on his brow, Davos turned to the Iron Throne, staring at its jagged edges. He recalled the stories of men who'd been cut and scarred by it. He stepped up to it, resting one hand on the arm. Then, taking a resolute breath, he turned away and faced the hall. "I will not sit on this throne of swords unless I must," he declared, voice echoing. "It has taken enough blood already." Thus Davos Seaworth was crowned king by the people, though he did not rest upon the Iron Throne. The news spread through King's Landing in a rush of excitement, fear, and uncertainty. Some said it was a sham, that the lords had caved to the mob. Others said it was the realm's rebirth. The small folk lit candles in the alleys that night, celebrating with what scraps of food and drink they had. Even the grim sprawl of Flea Bottom flickered with cautious joy, the name King Davos whispered with reverence. In the days that followed, King Davos began the slow, grueling work of turning promises into realities. The city was on edge, unsure if the new king's word could hold. But for now, a calm settled over the capital like the eye of a storm that had spent its fury and paused to gather again. Davos, determined not to let the realm slide back into chaos, expanded the city watch with men of proven character, commoners recommended by their neighbors, soldiers who had fought bravely without succumbing to pillage, even knights known for their honor. Corruption would not be tolerated. Bronn took a lead role in training them. His skill in warfare was undeniable, even if his moral compass had once wavered. Now, with Davos's fair wages and a pragmatic appeal, he found a place in the new regime. Davos also introduced local representatives, trusted men and women from each district of King's Landing, who met in open forums to discuss the people's needs. The lords grumbled, but Davos insisted. "If we don't listen to them," he said, "someone else will, and use that power for ill." Challenges soon arose. Officials abused their stations to extort merchants, pocketing silver. When Davos discovered these schemes, he had the culprits arrested and tried publicly. A dozen were found guilty and sentenced to either banishment or the Night's Watch should the North accept them. Many lords wanted harsher punishments, beheadings, and the like, but Davos refused to begin his reign with bloodshed. "Let the wall make use of them," he said, "or the cold will end them. That's justice enough for me." Slowly, the city settled into a new rhythm, wary but hopeful. Markets reopened, though goods were scarce. In sheltered merchants from outside, a trickle of trade resumed. Davos spent royal funds, what little he could find, to hire workers who repaired docks, cleared debris, and rebuilt gates. These projects gave starving men a wage and purpose. Each day brought fresh crises, but also small victories that encouraged the people to believe in their unlikely king. Across the realm, word spread of Davos's coronation. In taverns by the sea, men spoke of the smuggler king who walked among the poor. Some laughed, some were intrigued. Mercenaries tested fortune in the capital, with some joining the city watch for steady pay. Traveling merchants told tales of how the new king turned from the Iron Throne in a gesture of humility. Skeptics called it foolish. Others found it inspiring. But few were indifferent. It was not a golden age. Hunger still gnawed the city, winter held tight, and outlaws skulked in the countryside. More than once, Davos received letters threatening him, accusing him of usurping a throne that belonged to this or that distant heir. None had the immediate power to march, for the realm was too fractured. Davos hoped that ongoing negotiations with the Stormlands and the Reach would deter an uprising. Better to show strength through unity than pick fights on every front. Davos found a measure of peace in the routine of governance, though the weight was immense. He wrote letters each day, giving instructions to envoys, responding to lords and small folk alike. He met with local representatives in the keep's courtyard, hearing their pleas. High bread prices, and scrupulous moneylenders, missing children. Every story cut him, but he would not turn away. Perhaps that set him apart from kings of old. He did not pretend to be infallible or above the concerns of common folk. One chilly evening, Davos stood atop the Red Keep's walls, the wind tugging at his cloak, carrying salt from Blackwater Bay. From here, King's Landing sprawled beneath him, lights winking in the darkness. The people, his people, lived and suffered below. Footsteps approached, and Brienne joined him on the parapet. "Majesty," she said softly, as though even she found the word awkward. "Brienne," he replied, studying the city. "I wonder how many kings stood here, believing they could bend those streets to their will." She considered that. "Likely many. Yet the city remains, and so do its people." He nodded. "I never wanted this, but I can't ignore their cries. I only hope I'm the right man for it. I have doubts." Brienne's voice was steady. "You are honest, and you care for more than yourself. That is more than most kings can claim." He offered a weary smile. "Let's hope it's enough." They stood in silence, gazing at the torches flickering below. The cold air bit, but Davos felt a warmth inside him, the ember of belief that this fragile peace could hold, if he worked tirelessly to nurture it. Weeks bled into months. As the first stirrings of spring teased the realm, Davos's policies slowly took hold. Limited trade resumed. Grain from the Reach trickled in. The King's Council functioned, if only because no one wanted more chaos. Exhausted by wars, many recognized that Davos's approach, sharing power, focusing on rebuilding, might be the only chance for a lasting peace. Rumors of rebellion still brewed. Some in the Westerlands, battered though they were, whispered of a Lannister heir. The Iron Islands threatened to raid. Dorne weighed independence. The North was quiet but distant. Davos proceeded carefully, sending envoys to each region, urging unity. Some answered, some did not. Threats loomed like storm clouds, but for the moment, the capital held firm. Davos suffered a fever 1 week, nearly losing him. The maesters tended him anxiously, aware that without their new king, the city might unravel. He survived, pale and thinner, but all the more resolved not to fail. As soon as he could stand, he visited Flea Bottom, letting the people see that he still lived and cared. One day, he went to an orphanage the faith had set up on the outskirts. He brought some bread and candied fruit. The children rushed forward, excited by any distraction from hunger. One small boy, eyes bright, asked if Davos really was once a smuggler. Davos knelt and showed him the shortened fingers on his right hand, Stannis's punishment for smuggling. He said, I lost these for breaking the law, but I kept my life because I also saved a castle from starvation. Sometimes we do what we must, but there are consequences. The boy stared, fascinated. The other children pressed around as Davos handed out the small gifts he'd brought. Their laughter momentarily banished the gloom weighing him down. He left more determined than ever that no child should starve because of another man's ambition. Around this time, Davos summoned the King's Council to discuss restructuring the realm's governance. The old offices, feudal obligations, and titles needed adapting. In a cramped hall once used for royal banquets, Davos proposed a draft charter guaranteeing certain rights to the small folk, limiting the lord's ability to levy taxes without the crown's oversight, and providing each region a seat on a grand council that would meet twice a year. It won't solve all our ills, he admitted, but it might prevent abuses and keep lines of communication open. No longer will one house hold the realm hostage. We share the burden of rule. The small folk must have recourse if a lord is cruel. The crown stands as mediator, not tyrant. The council erupted in argument. Some praised the idea, others called it heresy. Davos remained firm, citing the endless wars they had endured. We've lost too much to cling blindly to tradition. We must do better. After hours of debate, they agreed to draft the charter, though it would take months of negotiation to satisfy the major houses. Davos stayed patient, knowing real change demanded time. While negotiations dragged, life in King's Landing trudged on. Street vendors returned. Minstrels sang ballads of a king who walked among the poor. Smiths hammered nails to rebuild homes and swords to protect them. A fragile hope spread through the city, as though they stood at the threshold of a future that might finally break the endless cycle of war. For Davos, days were long and nights restless. He studied tax ledgers, trade maps, listened to pleas from mothers seeking lost children or from traveling merchants needing safe routes. Each story weighed on him, but he refused to turn away. Maybe that was the key, he would not close his eyes to the realm's suffering. When the last snows melted into muddy spring, Davos's coronation had withstood its first winter. Much remained uncertain in Westeros, yet a new seed had been planted. Each day, more small folk believed they would not be crushed beneath the boots of the mighty. Each day, more lords acknowledged that old ways might be gone for good. Davos sometimes returned to the ramparts at dawn, watching the sun rise over Blackwater Bay. He recalled the countless dawns he'd spent aboard a smuggler's ship, scanning the horizon for sails or storms. Then the future had been no larger than his next haul. Now it encompassed the realm and all who lived under its sky. The scale was daunting, but he vowed not to fail them if he could help it. No, he was not a perfect king. He learned as he went, relied on counsel, trusted the honest hearts around him. Yet in that vulnerability lay his greatest strength. He did not hide behind the crown or use it as a bludgeon. He was simply Davos Seaworth, once a smuggler, now a king, an unlikely champion chosen by a city on the brink. Even if he fell on the morrow, he would strive to give them hope today. So, with every minor victory and stumble, Davos's reign took firmer root. The city still bore scars of war, but its fires of destruction had died down. In their place, a cautious flame of unity flickered, nurtured by a man who knew what it was to have nothing and who understood the depth of human suffering. Though dangers loomed, the people sensed a shift. For the first time in generations, the crown belonged to someone who feared the Iron Throne rather than lusted after it, and who recognized that the greatest strength of the realm was not in bloodlines or dragons, but in the shared dreams and yearnings of every soul who called Westeros home. This was Davos Seaworth, crowned by the voices of the many, forging a new destiny for the Seven Kingdoms. Davos Seaworth had never asked for a crown. By the time he found himself at the heart of the realm's darkest hour, the calloused hands that once handled smuggled onions and fish on the Blackwater Bay had also handled swords, heartbreak, and truths far heavier than he could have imagined in his youth. Snow flecked the black of his hair, now turned gray, an unassuming badge of winter's slow arrival, and his tired eyes surveyed the city that had once spurned him. From every shadowed alley of Flea Bottom to the high towers of the Red Keep, people now whispered his name with a reverence never before granted him. He was born a common man of the narrow sea, molded by salt and hardship, a smuggler who had survived impossible storms and the punishments that followed. Yet here he stood, with hundreds, no, thousands of small folk in the streets. Children, cheeks smudged with soot, lifted wooden spoons as if they were scepters. Fishermen, reeking of salt and seaweed, pressed their worn palms over their hearts. Mothers and wives, cloaks too thin for the biting wind, held onto their hope for a better future. From every corner came the echo of voices raised in startling unity, calling his name in unison when he stepped through the tall, battered gates of the Red Keep. Davos. Long live Davos. It felt like madness, like a dream from which he might wake at any moment. But the ache in his bones and the chill that pierced his skin told him otherwise. He could sense, with each trembling beat of his heart, that this was real. The memory of King Stannis Baratheon hovered in his thoughts, a grim-faced testament to the strictest sense of duty. Davos had followed him, believed in his harsh principles of justice, and weathered storms both literal and political in that man's name. Yet kings and lords had time and again proven themselves fallible, leaving the small folk to bear the brunt of their failures. After years of war, broken alliances, and confusion over royal succession, it was the small folk themselves who had stepped forward to make a choice. They lifted up the low-born knight who had once been a smuggler, believing he might finally bring them together. He tried to quiet their cries, raising his hands for silence, but devotion swelled around him. The gold cloaks, those guardians of the city who were once used to intimidate and oppress, stood to the side now, uncertain whether to bow or to stand at attention, unable to deny the force of the crowd's fervor. Davos's heart drummed in his chest. He had spent so many years serving first his own family as a humble provider, then Stannis, then the living themselves when the dead came calling. Never had he desired this new station, and yet he could not find it in himself to simply refuse. A smuggler from Flea Bottom had no business with a throne, but the people's call suggested otherwise. The old ways had crumbled under the weight of too many broken promises, and something new was forming in their place. The Iron Throne had consumed so many who craved it. It had melted ambitious men and women in the crucible of power, proven a seat for the brutal and the mad alike. But now it seemed to beckon a man who had once known the taste of true hunger, who had labored in obscurity, and who understood the needs of those sleeping in cold hovels. Standing before a crowd with eyes lit by hope, Davos felt a crushing weight pressing upon him, demanding that he lead them somewhere better if he could. Ser Davos, came a soft voice from behind. Turning, he saw a sister of the faith, a solemn figure wrapped in plain robes. She looked up at him as if he were touched by the seven. The small folk wait on your word. He swallowed. How could he guide anyone's destiny when he scarcely believed in his own royal claim? Still, the hunger and desperation in so many faces propelled him. He cleared his throat, willing his voice not to shake. My friends, he began, you know me, Davos Seaworth, born with nothing but my wits and a boat. I never thought to see this day. I do not hunger for power. He faltered, unsure of what else he might say. A hush fell. In that silence, he could hear the cold wind ghosting against the castle walls and the strangled clank of metal from some distant guard post. The hush carried the weight of thousands of lives looking to him for answers. A child perched on a man's shoulders stared at him, wide-eyed, the pure expression of unvarnished hope. It made his chest tighten. I am no prince, Davos continued, forcing his voice to carry. I have been hand to a king, but I started life in Flea Bottom. I know what it is to be hungry, to live in fear of the next day's misfortune. I've watched too many wars kill too many innocents. But if you call on me now, I will answer. Not out of pride or glory or ambition, but because I cannot bear to watch you suffer anymore. If it is your will, then I will serve you. That I swear." He stopped, scarcely believing the vow leaving his mouth. The crowd roared in reply. Tears stained the cheeks of those closest, their voices echoing along every cobbled street. They shouted for a new era, for a king who knew their struggles. From where Davos stood, it felt like stepping into the path of a tidal wave, one he could neither outrun nor resist. Glancing up at the Red Keep, its high walls pitted by fire, battered by sieges, and haunted by ghosts of cruelty, Davos felt that those walls were now to be his burden. He turned back to the crowd. "I can promise you only this: I will strive for fairness above all. Justice, not cruelty. Mercy, not tyranny. May the gods help me keep this oath." The roar increased, a quake in the very air. With a heaviness in his step, Davos allowed himself to be led through the gate. Inside the courtyard, the hush fell again like the calm after thunder. Knights, soldiers, and onlookers parted for him. He glimpsed men in threadbare leathers, battered from wars they had scarcely understood, standing uncertainly in that yard. Each stared at him with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and fear. He continued into the keep. The corridors, once lively with torches, had grown dim and drafty. Many sconces were unlit and the floor was scarred by scorch marks. Scattered tapestries hung in tatters. Davos passed servants who shrank back against the walls, not sure if this new claimant would prove as dangerous as the last. A hand on his shoulder made him turn. Brienne of Tarth, tall, her armor showing signs of many battles, peered down at him with a reluctant smile. "They're calling you your grace now." He shook his head. "I'd rather they didn't. I've been Davos my whole life, and I'm still Davos now." Her smile remained faint. "The city may insist, but I understand." He noted the small scars on her face, the shadows under her eyes. She was among the few he trusted completely, a knight forged by loyalty rather than petty ambition. Together, they reached the tall doors of the throne room. Torchlight reflected off the metal reliefs, casting shifting glimmers across their path. Davos paused, breathing deeply. Countless powerful souls had perished chasing what lay within. His heart thumped a warning in his chest. Yet he saw no choice but to enter. Pushing open the doors, he stepped inside. The throne room was silent, and sunbeams filtered through colored glass, splaying a mosaic of light across the floor. Ahead stood the Iron Throne, that monstrous seat of twisted swords forged by the flames of a conqueror's dragon. A chill seemed to hang in the air. Davos advanced, his footsteps echoing in the vastness, the ghosts of Targaryens, Lannisters, and Baratheons seeming to watch. He stopped at the dais. "I'll not sit there," he said, barely louder than a whisper, turning toward Brienne. "Not yet. Too many men have died on its account. If I am to be crowned, let me at least speak with those who remain first." She inclined her head. "I'll help you summon them." He reached out to lay a hand on one of the melted hilts at the throne's base, feeling the cold metal beneath his palm. The entire realm was as fractured as these swords once had been, and now some wild chance had placed him here. He withdrew, then glanced at Brienne, who nodded and departed to gather the few nobles still lingering in King's Landing. Left alone, Davos stood under the colored shafts of light. His mind drifted to the faces of his lost children, the memory of his humble beginnings, and the bare fact that a commoner was about to claim a seat shaped by dragons and conquest. Absurdity taunted him, but outside, the city still roared his name, and he knew he had become more symbol than man. With a final glance at the throne's jagged edges, he murmured a quiet prayer for guidance. Soon after, the double doors opened again, admitting a group of uneasy lords and ladies. War had decimated their ranks. Some had died outright, others had fled or bent the knee to other claimants. Those who remained wore the worn expressions of people too exhausted to fight another fruitless battle. A tall, gaunt knight with thinning hair stepped forward. Ser Joffrey Cask. He bowed stiffly, his eyes haunted. "Ser Davos," he said, forcing politeness. "We have heard news that the city wishes you for their king." Davos inclined his head in return. "They do, though I never claimed a birthright. But the realm is in crisis, and the small folk believe I can unite it, or at least protect them." A ripple of uncertain murmurs rose. A woman, Lady Adeline of Rosby, spoke with thinly veiled doubt. "We cannot ignore centuries of precedent. Are we to crown a man simply because the streets cry for him?" Davos met her gaze. "My lady, I know well the power of noble houses. I've served the realm in war and peace. I do not seek to usurp rightful claims. Yet how many rightful kings have we seen in recent years, each leaving the realm more ruined than the last? The small folk have chosen me because they are weary of bloodshed. If you have someone else you think can do better, someone the people might accept, I won't stand in their way. But I fear no such person exists. Too many old names are drowned in blood." She hesitated. The silence in the hall was broken only by the faint crackle of torches. Another man stepped forward, this one stoop-shouldered with a lined face. Lord Timon Penrose of the Stormlands, a lesser lord who had survived the Baratheon conflicts. "I remember you from King Stannis' service. You were loyal and honest. The realm needs that. Still, how do you intend to feed the city, or defend it, or keep the lords in line? The Targaryen threat might be gone or might not be, who knows? The Iron Islands never stay quiet long. The North stands apart." Davos spread his hands. "I cannot do it alone, my lord. If I sit on that throne, I do so with your help. Not to subjugate you, but to unite you in a cause greater than ambition. We must rebuild trade, feed our people, and ensure bandits do not roam unchecked. There's no cunning scheme that can replace honest cooperation. That's all I can offer." He saw their eyes shift with uncertainty. But there was also something else there, a flicker of fragile hope. In the end, war had made them all so weary that a king who spoke of fairness seemed a new possibility. Brienne, standing near, cleared her throat. "We propose a great council that the lords who remain may decide together how best to proceed." One by one, these diminished nobles agreed. The city clamored for Davos, and none of them had a stronger candidate. With that, the group disbanded to carry word to outlying lords, and Davos felt both relief and apprehension. The days to come would shape the fate of the Seven Kingdoms, what was left of them, and his own life beyond anything he had known. In the meantime, Davos did not cloister himself within the Red Keep. He walked the city, flanked by a few loyal guards and by the towering figure of Brienne when she was in King's Landing. The capital was battered beyond measure, many buildings burned or in disrepair, children begging on corners, corpses occasionally found in alleyways. The air stank of desperation. But wherever he went, the small folk reached for him, calling out his name. He listened to their stories, trying to find small remedies where he could, arranging for bread distribution, ensuring the city watch did not terrorize the poor. He was only one man, but his presence lit a candle of hope in a place that had grown too familiar with darkness. King's Landing responded to that hope like parched soil taking in the first drops of rain. Still, Davos knew the city's survival depended on forging alliances with the lords outside its walls. Brienne left for the Stormlands to invite them to the Great Council and plead for food. Others traveled to the Reach, still reeling from war but capable of growing the realm's grain. Davos worked around the clock with a ragged new council, a few lesser lords, the High Septon's representative, and even Bronn, the Sellsword who had turned Castellan. This makeshift council was a motley crew, forced to address matters of trade, security, and the city's nearly empty coffers. Food was the most pressing issue. The Crownlands had been stripped bare by armies and bandits. Winter gnawed at the land. Merchant ships avoided the harbor, fearing raids at sea and chaos on land. Davos proposed repairing a handful of royal galleys, once part of the neglected navy, so they could escort trade ships from Essos or the Reach. It was a gamble, since they had precious little coin for repairs, but the alternative was to starve. Meanwhile, the city watch was rife with corruption, some of its officers abusing the small folk. Davos fired the worst offenders and threatened banishment or the Night's Watch for anyone caught extorting people. That trimmed the watch to a skeleton crew, but he believed honest few were better than a legion of thugs. To fill the gap, he recruited local volunteers recommended by their neighbors, men and women who understood the city's streets and had no appetite for cruelty. The lords grumbled. To arm peasants seemed madness to them, a breach of feudal order. But Davos insisted. They needed eyes and ears throughout the city, and the people had to feel some measure of control over their own fate. A faint stirring of hope began to ripple. Street markets popped up again, though with paltry wares. A few ships ventured into the harbor, lured by Davos's offer of waived docking fees and escort galleys. Life still teetered on the edge, but each small step helped. Whenever Davos appeared in public, the people cheered, an adoration he found humbling and terrifying. Their expectations felt like a colossal weight on his shoulders. Brienne returned from the Stormlands with news that a handful of lords would attend the Great Council, albeit warily. She reported that they might send some wagons of grain as a gesture of goodwill, enough to keep the city from collapsing for a few more weeks. Similar messengers from the Reach and the Vale trickled in, though many great lords of the realm had died or hidden themselves away. No one wanted the cost of open war again. That alone gave Davos a chance to create something different. On the morning set for the Great Council, the sky dawned uncommonly bright. Snow glistened on rooftops, and the Red Keep's repaired gates creaked open to admit envoys, lesser lords, and what few heads of major houses remained. Their banners, ragged from the last wars, fluttered in a crisp wind. The throne room was cleared of debris and warmed as best as possible by hearth fires. The Iron Throne loomed, but Davos stood near it, not on it, clad in practical finery rather than the sumptuous velvets of old. His shortened fingers, the legacy of Stannis' justice, remained an unspoken reminder of how different this king was. Lord Valerion, iron-haired and proud, stepped forward first. He had once supported Stannis at sea. Now he studied Davos as though trying to see the future in his eyes. "Ser Davos Seaworth," he said, letting the name ring in the hall. "The city calls you King Davos. The small folk rally around you, but you have no blood claim to the throne. Why should the lords of Westeros bend the knee to a common-born man?" Davos did not flinch. "My lord, I claim no right by blood. The people who have known too much war called me. They ask for a king who understands their pain. I do not seek to overthrow any rightful house. But the realm is shattered and we need unity. The question is, can we abandon the old lines of succession long enough to give the realm a chance at peace? For if we do not, I fear we'll have more war. I offer fairness, open dealings, and a crown that does not weigh upon our necks like a yoke." A hum of conversation ran through the assembled lords. Some looked thoughtful, others were wary. One Stormlands lord, older and stooped, stepped forward with a cough. "We recall you fought bravely under Stannis Baratheon. He was a hard man, but just, perhaps you learned from him. Show us how you plan to keep the peace. Will you impose your will by force, or will you let each region manage itself?" Davos exhaled. "The realm is too large for a single man to micromanage. Each region has its traditions, its lords. I propose a council, one that meets regularly, representing the major houses and the needs of the common folk. The crown will arbitrate disputes, ensure no house grows tyrannical, and coordinate defense against foreign threats or internal rebellions. But I'll not raise an army simply to feed my own ambition." Another round of murmuring swept the hall. This was no mere recitation of claims. It was an attempt to reshape how the Seven Kingdoms were governed. The High Septon's delegate, a solemn Septon with a kindly face, stepped forward. "The faith supports whatever keeps the people safe. Do you swear to protect the faithful and hold to the gods' justice?" Davos inclined his head. "I do swear it. Yet I also swear not to persecute those who hold to the old gods or other faiths in peace. The wars of faith have spilled too much blood. Let us not repeat them." Though the Septon seemed mildly unsettled by the notion of complete tolerance, he did not protest. Tolerance was better than chaos. In the end, over hours of debate, the lords gradually acceded to Davos's plan, some grudgingly, some eagerly. The memory of endless battles and lost loved ones weighed heavily on all. House after house agreed to work. With King Davos under a new system, they would respect his crown as a mediator and symbol of unity, while retaining governance of their lands as long as they did so fairly. He, in turn, would not raise levies or tax them beyond reason. He would encourage trade, sponsor reconstruction, and ensure none rose to threaten the peace. At last, Lord Valerion emerged once more with a simple iron circlet. It was no grand relic, just a hammered band, but it was offered with a solemn vow. "We name Davos Seaworth King of the Seven Kingdoms, or what remains of them, by the will of the council and the people." Davos took the crown, hands trembling. He thought of his family, his children lost to war, the wife who once waited for him by the sea, the ragged youths of Flea Bottom. He remembered the night he was knighted for smuggling onions that saved Stannis' starving forces. He remembered the bitter taste of defeat and the savage cost of victory. A swirl of emotion tightened in his chest, but he lifted the circlet to his brow. "I accept, and I vow to serve this realm, to heed its voice, and to preserve its peace." A deafening cheer erupted. led more by the commoners who had crept in to witness this historic moment. The lords joined in more slowly, some enthusiastic, others only resigned to a future they no longer had the strength to resist. Brienne allowed herself a small, quiet smile. The High Septon's delegate gave a brief blessing. Then Davos turned to the Iron Throne, paused, and faced the hall instead. Too many have bled for that twisted seat of blades. I will not rest upon it today. Let its memory remind us of what ambition can do if we let it rule us. Thus, Davos Seaworth became king by the will of the people and the council, though he stood before the throne rather than sitting upon it. Across King's Landing, the news flashed like lightning. Some shouted with joy, others shook their heads in disbelief. Those who had starved and bled saw in Davos a beacon of change. Throughout the night, candles glowed in windows, and the name King Davos drifted on the air alongside songs from old minstrels and the quiet sobs of relief. Yet it was an uneasy relief. Hard times were not banished by a single coronation. The weeks that followed saw Davos grappling with the crushing reality of governance. He convened a new King's Council, composed of lesser lords, pragmatic knights, Bronn as commander of the City Watch, and the Septon to represent the faith. This patchwork group debated how to feed the city, how to rebuild roads, how to handle outlaws in the countryside. At dawn, Davos would walk the ramparts, wondering if he could truly keep the promises he had made. By dusk, he was buried in ledgers, lists of supplies, and pleas from all corners of the capital. He spent more coin than the crown truly had repairing the docks and a few battered warships. He believed a functioning port was the city's lifeblood. Ships from Essos began trickling in, bringing grain, salted fish, and other essentials assured by Davos's pledge of an armed escort. It was nowhere near enough to feed the entire city comfortably, but it staved off complete famine. The City Watch, under Bronn's drill and King Davos's moral strictures, slowly transformed. Out went the most corrupt, replaced by those with a measure of conscience or a desire for honest wages. Some gold cloaks chafed under the new order, but Davos would not tolerate bribery or cruelty. In time, rumors spread that the Watch now actually protected the people more than it preyed on them. The difference was not night and day, but it was enough to spark further hope. Davos also insisted on regular open forums in which representatives from different districts of King's Landing could voice concerns. The lords found it bizarre to see bakers, fishmongers, or even beggars standing before the king, talking about bread prices or unsafe alleys. Yet Davos listened carefully and urged the council to respond. He felt that if they ignored such voices, they would only invite rebellion. The city had chosen him because of his humble roots, and he could not betray that trust. Still, wariness festered beyond the walls. The Westerlands, led by remnants of House Lannister's bannermen, eyed King's Landing with suspicion. The Iron Islands, as ever, toyed with raids and independence. Dorne, having suffered through repeated conflicts, remained aloof, considering whether to separate entirely. The North, battered by its own wars, was all but sovereign in practice, though a few northern lords still visited out of curiosity about this Onion King. Some letters arrived at the Red Keep, full of threats or sneers challenging Davos's right to rule. Yet none marched on the city. Too many had died in the last wars to desire a new one without good cause, and Davos's leadership in the capital made immediate conquest a poor gamble. He sought alliances with quiet diligence. He wrote to the north, acknowledging their hardships and offering them trade benefits if they would remain part of the realm. He sent envoys to Dorne, promising them greater autonomy under his crown than they had ever had under the Targaryens or Baratheons. He asked the Riverlands for help patrolling roads in exchange for favorable tariffs on their goods in King's Landing. Every day he juggled letters and hammered out new solutions, leaning heavily on anyone in his circle with experience in diplomacy. More than once, he cursed his own lack of noble schooling, but he persevered. Honesty, he found, sometimes proved more persuasive than cunning. Lords who might have spurned flatterers found themselves intrigued by a king who spoke plainly. Amid the hard labor of ruling, Davos endured his share of setbacks. A group of unscrupulous officials in the Red Keep was caught siphoning off funds meant for rebuilding the city walls. He put them on trial before the public, sentencing several to the Night's Watch, banishing others. Some watchers called it weakness that he did not simply execute them. But Davos held firm, "I will not begin my reign with needless bloodshed. Let them serve somewhere they cannot harm the innocent." A wave of petty crime rose in Flea Bottom when rumors spread of a new shipment of grain, leading desperate folk to raid storehouses. The city watch intervened, sparking riots. Davos personally went into the district to talk with the ringleaders, accompanied only by a small guard. Many there recognized him, remembered his old smuggler days, and that alone prevented bloodshed. He brokered a solution that doled out some grain at reduced cost, offset by a small tax on incoming ships. It was a precarious balance, but it quelled the riots. His days blurred with the burdens of kingship. Yet he never refused an audience from a grieving mother or a crippled soldier who asked to speak with him. He recalled Stannis' stern code of duty, tempered by the compassion he had discovered within himself. Each evening he crawled into bed, bone-weary, only to rise before dawn and do it again. When he found rare moments of quiet, Davos would walk the Red Keep's ramparts and watch the sea. He remembered the freedom of the open water, the salt spray on his face when his only worry had been the law or rough weather. Now, the entire realm weighed on his shoulders. At times, it seemed too much. But the memory of children smiling at him on the streets, or the thanks of a beggar who found a bit of bread, or the gentle tears of a widow relieved by some small mercy, these were what steadied him. The seeds Davos planted slowly took root. The battered city gates were repaired, new watchtowers set up to ward against bandits. Merchant caravans began to arrive from the Reach, bringing fresh produce in the budding spring. From the Stormlands came salted fish, from the Vale came metals for forging tools. People returning to the capital found not a lawless ruin, but a city striving to rebuild. Tensions remained, lords bickered, some threatened to withhold supplies if they did not get the privileges they wanted, but Davos navigated these disputes with a mixture of humility and determination. As the last of the winter snows melted from the city's rooftops, Davos proposed a grand charter to formalize this new order. Each region would have a delegate in a standing council. Laws regarding taxation and levies would require the crown's oversight but could not be set unilaterally, and the small folk would have local representatives to plead their case at regular intervals. The lords balked at parts of it, some thought it too lenient on peasants, some thought it too intrusive in their ancient rights, but Davos stood firm, reminding them how close the realm had come to total ruin. "We can keep patching holes in a sinking ship," he said, "or we can build a stronger vessel." After long wrangling, enough lords assented to draft the charter in earnest. It was a living document, subject to refinement, but it marked a sea change in Westerosi governance, an acknowledgement that top-down rule from a single monarch or single great house might not suffice. Past kings had attempted partial reforms, but rarely had there been such impetus for real cooperation. Even as some lords grudgingly accepted these changes, rumors of potential uprisings swirled. One letter arrived from a Lannister loyalist, laden with veiled threats about restoring true order. Another came from an Ire-born captain boasting that Davos's monarchy would never tame the sea. Davos read them all, but he did not rise to the bait. Instead, he shored up the capital's defenses, rallied his meager navy, and continued to court alliances with houses large and small. Rather than prepare for war, he prepared to prevent it if at all possible. In time, subtle shifts began to show. A few minor Westerlands lords, disillusioned with the old ways and seeing potential profit in Davos's stable capital, sent envoys seeking trade agreements. Dorne remained aloof but did not outright reject the idea of a new alliance. The North mostly kept its distance, but certain lesser northern lords visited King's Landing to gauge the new king. When they met Davos, plain, unpretentious, and earnest in his desire for peace, they left with something like respect warming their hearts. The winter was long, but perhaps a thaw had begun. During one such meeting, Davos felt a pang of sorrow as he recalled those he had lost, particularly the children who once looked to him for protection. It was that memory, that sense of having failed them, that drove him to do better for every child in the realm. He commissioned small expansions to orphanages sponsored by the faith and insisted that any new farmland or fishery set aside a fraction of its yield for the destitute. Cynics grumbled about charity draining the crown's resources, but Davos had seen the consequences of leaving the poor to rot. He also made sure to handle justice personally, at least in the capital, whenever severe crimes arose. On a wooden platform set up in a courtyard near the Red Keep, the king would hear trials in front of gathered crowds. Murderers, rapists, or traitors faced him in full view of the people. Davos strove to be fair, sometimes sentencing the guilty to the wall or to labor repairing roads if their crimes were less dire. When asked why he spared so many from the headsman's axe, he said quietly, "Too many corpses have wept their blood on these stones. Let us find another path if we can." This approach earned him both admiration from the small folk who saw in him a man who did not kill lightly and suspicion from the old nobility who considered his leniency a sign of weakness. Whispers circulated that if a real threat arose, King Davos would prove too soft to quell it. He heard these whispers but let them be. If the day came when steel had to be met with steel, he would do so. Yet he would not stain his reign with unnecessary brutality. Seasons crept onward, the land swelling with new green. The city's markets expanded, though the memory of hunger still lingered. The king's council functioned, at times fractious, but it actually did the work of governance. Davos walked the streets in simpler attire than any king in memory, accompanied by a few trusted guards. Citizens bowed, but many also reached to clasp his hand or show him small tokens of gratitude. On one occasion, a blacksmith's daughter pressed a carved wooden onion into his palm, a symbol of his old smuggler's sigil. "We've not had a king like you before," she murmured. Davos felt tears threaten, and he managed only a nod in return. Yet outside King's Landing, challenges still abounded. Raider bands in the Riverlands defied any lord's authority, living off pillage. Half a dozen times, Davos sent small forces to support local lords in rooting them out. The news reached him that the rebels included deserters from old armies, men who had lost everything and saw no future in the new order. It pained him to hear, but he knew they could not be allowed to terrorize the countryside. The Ironborn tested the waters with sporadic raids on the coast, which Davos's fledgling navy tried to repel. Several skirmishes ended inconclusively, but at least the Ironborn did not mount a larger invasion. Letters from Dorne hinted at a faction pushing for complete independence. Others in Dorne seemed open to negotiation, perhaps if Davos granted them broad local authority. He weighed each letter carefully, uncertain how far to bend without compromising the realm's unity. A bigger jolt arrived when the Lannister loyalists in the Westerlands staged an open revolt under the banner of a rumored distant cousin of the Lannisters. They mustered several hundred men and seized a minor holdfast, declaring that they would march on King's Landing to restore the rightful order. With the city still recovering, with no large standing army at his disposal, Davos could not simply dispatch thousands of troops to crush this rebellion. Instead, he called upon allies in the Riverlands and the Crownlands, reminding them of their vow to keep the peace. Some lords grumbled, reluctant to expose their men to further risk. But Davos pointed out that if they allowed the rebellion to spread, trade routes would be cut off, and their own lands would suffer. In the end, a joint force of Riverlands knights, Crownlands levies, and a small contingent from the Stormlands marched against the would-be Lannister claimant. Brienne led part of this force, while Davos remained in King's Landing to ensure the city did not fall to a second threat. Letters from the front painted a tense picture. The rebels holed up in a fortress, proclaiming they fought for highborn rights against the flea-bottom king. That stung Davos like salt in a wound. But he ignored the insult. His birth had shaped him, not stained him. The loyalist force, guided by Brienne's cautious tactics and reinforced by local lords who saw the rebels as a threat to stability, surrounded the fortress. In a matter of weeks, they starved the rebels out and forced a surrender. Casualties on both sides were not trivial, but not devastating either. The Lannister pretender was taken captive. Word reached King's Landing that he demanded trial by combat, proclaiming Davos was too lowborn to judge him. Davos, wanting to avoid needless bloodshed, granted the request. Brienne herself served as champion for the crown. The duel was brutal but short. Brienne, seasoned by countless battles, ended the pretender's claim with a swift, clean blow. The rebellion died with him. The survivors were given a choice: lay down arms and swear loyalty to King Davos's realm, or face exile. Many bent the knee, too exhausted or hungry for more war. News of this small victory resonated throughout Westeros. Some took it as proof that Davos's brand of kingship was not a sign of weakness, that he could defend his claim if pressed. Others muttered that the realm might yet dissolve into further conflicts. But for the moment, no other major house rose against him. The cost in lives weighed on Davos, but he took solace in the fact that the rebellion had ended relatively quickly. By the time Brienne returned with her battered force, spring was well underway, and the crownlands were in bloom. She met Davos in the courtyard of the Red Keep, blood still crusted on her boots, her armor dented. He offered a weary smile. "You've done the realm a service," he said. She shrugged. "I only did what needed doing. The next time, perhaps show them your shortened fingers and remind them that you've faced worse odds." Davos's smile faded. "I'd rather show them a realm at peace. But I suppose we do what we must." He clasped her forearm. "Thank you, Brienne." Not all of his days were so grim. The city began to sprout new life, with repaired buildings, fresh markets, and the bustle of commerce returning. The open forums continued, often filled with petty squabbles, but also signs that people were learning to trust the new order. Even in Flea Bottom, fewer went to bed starving. Davos occasionally passed through its winding alleys, accompanied by only a pair of guards, receiving nods and calls of greeting that mingled respect with familiarity. One evening, after a day of hearing grievances, Davos ventured to the Great September of Baelor. Though it still showed cracks from past battles, it had been partially restored by the faithful. He slipped in quietly, finding a seat among the pews. The vast interior flickered with candlelight, shadows dancing across pillars and statues of the Seven. He lit a candle for his lost children, for the realms fallen, and for those still living. As he stood in silent reflection, the High Septon's delegate approached, nodding respectfully. "You carry a heavy burden, Your Grace." "I do," Davos replied. "But I chose it, didn't I? Perhaps. Or perhaps it chose you." Davos pondered that, gazing at the flame of his candle. "I only pray I can keep their faith." He left the sept feeling a renewed sense of resolve. The next morning, a messenger from the Reach arrived, announcing that several major houses of that fertile region recognized Davos's kingship in exchange for guaranteed protections for their trade. A similar message came from certain Vale lords who appreciated the routes he kept open for their stone and ore. It was tenuous, reliant on mutual benefit rather than love, but it was still an alliance that strengthened the capital's lifelines. With trade expanding and outlaws held somewhat in check, Davos turned his attention to finalizing the realm's new charter. Over weeks of heated discussions with lords in his council, he refined the laws around taxation, limiting exploitative levies, ensuring that a portion of all taxes would go into an emergency reserve for times of famine or crisis. He established guidelines for local justice, with the crown holding the right to intervene if a lord's judgments became cruel or arbitrary. Most shockingly to some, he included a clause that representatives of the small folk chosen by district or region would have the right to petition the crown directly at least twice a year, ensuring they could not be ignored by their own lords. The lords complained, but Davos reminded them how quickly the city had overthrown past rulers when pushed too far. "Better to let the small folk speak here in the keep than riot in the streets," he said. Little by little, the charter took shape as a document that might outlive him, ensuring that the realm could not be held hostage by a single tyrant or a single rebellious house. When all the major houses that recognized his reign finally ratified it, the city's bells rang in celebration. Davos stood on a platform at the Red Keep, reading the main points of the charter aloud to a gathered crowd. The small folk cheered and wept. While the lords and knights looked on, some with uncertain eyes but others with a spark of admiration. That evening, Davos's council gathered around him to toast the new era. It was a modest affair, no lavish feasts or rivers of wine, but there was a sense of pride in the air. Bronn, leaning back in his chair, smirked. "Well, I never thought I'd see the day when the crown would pay me to keep a city safe without me having to betray someone." Davos allowed himself a small grin. "You can thank the small folk for that. They're the ones who wanted me here." Bronn raised a cup. "To them, then. Let's hope they keep us around." Brienne quietly sipped her drink, nodding in agreement. The High Septon's representative said a short prayer. The maesters offered mild applause. It was far from the raucous revelry of old, but it felt genuine, a moment of calm in a kingdom that had known only turbulence. After the council dispersed, Davos strolled alone in the Red Keep's courtyard, letting the cool night air wash over him. Moonlight glanced off the fresh mortar in the walls. He paused by a newly planted garden patch, small and humble, tended by the keep servants. Kneeling, he ran his fingers through the soft earth, remembering how many had died hungry. Life was precious, fragile, and it needed to be nurtured with care. In the months that followed, the realm continued to adjust to this new equilibrium. Davos received formal recognition from more lords, though a handful of holdouts remained in the Westerlands and the Iron Islands. Dorne was still divided, with some houses secretly leaning toward full independence. The North watched from afar. Davos corresponded with them all, urging dialogue rather than confrontation. Meanwhile, King's Landing's population stabilized. People who had once fled returned to find employment in the shops and docks. Fleet Bottom remained poor and overcrowded, but far less desperate than before. The watchful eyes of the City Watch, reinforced by local volunteers, reduced street violence to a fraction of its former level. One day, a small delegation from White Harbor in the north arrived. They had come to gauge the capital's situation and present certain terms if the North were to reaffirm any ties to the Iron Throne. Davos received them warmly, recalling the times he had journeyed to the North on behalf of Stannis and how the living had united against the dead. Those old bonds and shared memories of a near apocalypse lingered. The Northerners were skeptical but not hostile. Over a week of talks, Davos assured them of the new charter's limits on royal power and the possibility for local autonomy. They left with cautious optimism, promising to share what they had learned with other northern houses. It was not a full victory, but it was a step toward bridging an ever-gaping divide. Around the same time, Dorne sent an envoy to request certain freedoms in governance, including full authority over local garrisons and the right to elect their own regional council without crown interference. Davos, valuing unity but wishing to avoid another war, negotiated patiently. He offered them broad autonomy under the crown's umbrella as long as they paid a modest tribute and refrained from any alliance with foreign powers. The envoy left to carry that offer back to Dorne. The solution might not please everyone, but Davos hoped it would forestall any violent break. All the while, Davos never truly lost his sense of being an outsider in the halls of power. He signed documents with the flourish of a man who had learned to read late in life, and he frequently paused mid-sentence to ensure he used a lord's correct title. Some of the older aristocrats regarded him with thinly veiled contempt for his birth. But the realm's exhaustion from war, combined with Davos's dogged commitment to honesty, gave him more leeway than any usurper might otherwise enjoy. Over time, many who had doubted him came to see the benefits of a monarch who genuinely listened, who did not levy ruinous taxes for vanity projects or foreign conquests. Meanwhile, the Red Keep itself transformed under his watch. Gone were gaudy displays of wealth. In their place were storerooms of grain and medical supplies for emergencies. He converted part of the sprawling castle into a dormitory for the orphans of war, at least until the faith could arrange proper homes. Unsurprisingly, rumors sprang up that King Davos was turning soft, coddling the lowborn. But to those who had lived under constant fear, these changes felt like a shield at last. Life in the capital was not easy, but it grew steadily more stable. Most nights, Davos lay down exhausted, with only a single small brazier to warm his chamber. He refused to stoke great fires in the royal apartments while the rest of the city shivered. Some nights he dreamt of the sea or of ghosts from the wars. Other nights he dreamt of his old smuggling skiff cutting through black waters under a moonlit sky. He would awaken with a start, reminded that he no longer ran from the law, but was the law itself. In the second year of Davos's reign, a fresh crisis threatened. The Iron Islanders, emboldened by news that the crown's forces were stretched thin, launched a major raid along the coast. A cluster of fishing villages was sacked and trade vessels were seized. Panic spread and calls for immediate retaliation poured into King's Landing. Some lords saw the chance to display their martial prowess. But Davos hesitated. He recognized that a full-scale invasion of the Iron Islands would be costly in lives and ships, especially given the battered state of the royal fleet. Instead, he mustered a smaller force of skilled mariners and a few sturdy warships, put them under a capable admiral who had once been a reaver himself, and tasked them with harassing the ironborn vessels without launching a fruitless invasion. At the same time, he reached out to the north and the riverlands for cooperation in patrolling the coasts. This cautious approach infuriated some who wanted a grand campaign of vengeance. But Davos stuck to his plan. Over the course of months, the raiders found themselves hounded by more disciplined forces. Captured Ironborn were put on trial in the port towns where they had raided, facing local justice. The Ironborn reevaluated their tactics, realizing that this new king, though no conqueror, would not let them raid unopposed. The conflict simmered without flaring into an all-out war. Eventually, an accord was reached with a faction of Iron Islanders who preferred trade to continuous raiding, though scattered marauders still refused any peace. Little by little, through negotiation, measured force, and unwavering fairness, Davos strengthened the realm's fragile unity. Word spread across Westeros of the Onion King, who had never sat long on the Iron Throne, who had lost the tips of his fingers for smuggling, who cared more for the well-being of orphans than for lavish feasts. The small folk held him in an almost mythic regard, spinning tales of how he had braved storms to bring them food in their darkest hours. Some lords still grumbled in private, but few could deny that the realm was more prosperous and less tyrannized than it had been in generations. There were no grand tournaments or spectacular feasts to mark Davos's success. Instead, the proof lay in fields that were no longer burned by marauding armies, in roads made safer by joint patrols, in cargo ships that sailed with guarded confidence into Blackwater Bay. Taxes were moderate but actually collected, rather than siphoned off by corrupt officials, and used to fund repairs, support the city watch, and prepare for winter stores. The outer wards of King's Landing slowly rebuilt, houses replacing ruins, families returning from exile. It was a subtle transformation, but a profound one. Davos, for his part, never forgot the cost of war. He took time whenever he could to visit with commoners, to share a humble meal or ask after their families. That humility guided his governance. He refused to become the sort of king who dined on excess while mothers begged for crumbs outside the castle gate. His council learned to expect frugality in his decisions and generosity toward the vulnerable. The realm, worn out by endless strife, gradually found an uneasy peace under his reign. Still, he knew there would always be those who pined for the old ways of grand houses, who believed birthright was everything. He knew in the decades to come, rival claimants might surface, or the system might falter if a cruel or weak successor took the crown. But for now, he set the stage for something different, something that gave voice to the unland and restricted the power of any who might seek to subjugate the realm. It was not a perfect solution, but it was better than the cycles of war he had lived through. On a crisp morning at the end of summer, Davos found himself standing once again in the throne room. Sunlight streamed through the stained-glass windows. The Iron Throne loomed at the far end, unused for months, a monument to the brutality of the past. He ascended the dais and studied its edges, trying to count how many blades it held. No one truly knew. Each sword told a story of a conquered foe or a subjugated lord. He laid a hand on one twisted hilt, the metal cool under his palm. He imagined for a moment if he had truly sat on that seat, embodying all it represented, absolute rule by right of conquest. How quickly might he turn into the very tyrants he had despised. Even the sturdiest man risked corruption when perched on such a razor-edged symbol of dominion. No, it was better to leave it as a silent reminder of how far they had come. Pulling his hand away, he turned and gazed at the quiet throne room. There was no crowd this day, no thunderous cheers, no trembling calls for a savior. Just a single smuggler king who had tried to do right by his people. He left the throne room, the iron crown resting lightly on his brow, lighter than the burdens of the realm, at least. Outside, the Red Keep's courtyard bustled with servants, guards, and a few children playing under watchful eyes. The city beckoned, alive with vendors, workers, and travelers who had come to trust that, under King Davos, they could ply their trades without being trampled by war. On the streets, the people might not be wealthy or carefree, but most had enough to eat and a measure of safety. In a land ravaged by repeated wars, that alone felt miraculous. Davos joined Brienne near the gates, where she was inspecting new recruits for the city watch. She noticed him and offered a respectful inclination of her head. He gave her a warm smile. "They look sturdy." She nodded. "They are. And they volunteered. Seems they think you're worth protecting." His gaze drifted to the men, then to the distant city rooftops. "I hope I can stay worthy of that faith." Brienne lifted her chin, the faintest of smiles crossing her scarred features. "You've done more than most kings already." He said nothing, letting her praise stand unchallenged. Together, they walked through the gates and into the city streets. Wherever Davos passed, small folk murmured greetings or bowed. He stopped a few times to speak with peddlers or craftsmen, inquiring about their trade. A fisherman boasted of how the harbor had become safer since the new patrols began. A baker complained about the cost of flour, but then admitted it was still better than when the city starved under other rulers. Each conversation chipped away at the mountain of problems, showing Davos where improvements were needed. Eventually, he paused at a modest fountain in a small square. Its water trickled over carved stone, an old fixture that had somehow survived the wars. Children played around its edges, mothers keeping watch. Davos knelt to let the cool water run over his hand. He felt the same old ache in his shortened fingers, a silent testimony of his origins and the price he had once paid for breaking the law in desperate times. Rising, he glanced at the children splashing in the fountain. They giggled and shrieked, unburdened by the cares of the realm. The mothers looked at him with a mixture of relief and respect. He returned a gentle nod. Yes, the realm was still full of conflict and would remain so. But these small moments of peace, these were what made it all worthwhile. A short while later, he and Brienne found themselves walking back toward the Red Keep under the waning sun. The day's glow lit the battered walls of the city with a warm light that almost made them look whole again. Davos's heart felt lighter too. A flicker of pride stirred in his chest. He thought of the endless nights he had lain awake, wondering if he could truly guide a broken realm. Now, it seemed that for a time he had. Brienne parted ways with him, returning to her duties. Davos made his way up to the ramparts. From there, he had a view of Blackwater Bay, its waters tinted gold and pink by the sunset. Memories rushed over him, the sea voyages, the onion boat, the siege of Storm's End. All the storms he had braved felt distant now, yet he was still that same man beneath the crown. He propped his arms on the stone, leaning over the crenellations. A breeze carried the brine scent of the bay. On some nights, he swore he could still hear the old creak of a small wooden skiff beneath him. He wondered if, in another life, he might have simply kept smuggling, feeding his family, dying a nobody. Yet fate, or the gods, or simply the will of the small folk had pulled him here. Despite the burdens, he felt profoundly grateful for the chance to make a difference. Below, the city thrummed with life. Flickers of torchlight danced. He spotted workers carrying crates off a docked ship, perhaps one of the newly arrived merchant vessels. He imagined its cargo might be sacks of grain, or salted fish, or a few rare spices. No matter. It was part of the slow, steady healing of King's Landing and of the realm beyond. As twilight settled, Davos stood there alone, the iron circlet firm on his brow, the wind teasing his cloak. He remembered the moment the people had cried out his name, lifting him from smuggler to king. He remembered turning from the Iron Throne, refusing to let it own him. And he remembered each promise he had made, to serve, to do better than those who had gone before, to honor the pain of the small folk and show them a path away from endless war. Though he could never undo the past, the misdeeds of kings and lords, or his own regrets, he had managed to give the realm a season of relative peace, to plant the seeds of a fairer order, and to hold a battered kingdom together through honest words and steady hands. Whether it would endure after him was a question for another day. For now, he had found a way to be both Davos Seaworth, the humble smuggler, and King Davos, the people's choice. The two identities merged under a single vow that bound him to the welfare of all. In the deepening dusk, he thought again of those old days on the sea, the smell of salt and the promise of freedom. Now, freedom came not from the dark waters but from the trust of a people who had seen too much pain. Perhaps that was the true meaning of his journey, that a man without lineage or fortune could be lifted by the voices of those who yearned for justice. And so long as he stayed true to them, so long as he walked among them, Davos believed he would remain worthy of their faith. He lingered at the ramparts until night fully embraced the sky, watching lights wink on across the city that had once been scarred by fire and blood. Somewhere out there, children drifted off to sleep under the safety of walls he had helped restore. Families fed by bread he had tirelessly worked to procure. Souls sheltered by an authority that no longer crushed them for sport or greed. If he accomplished nothing else in his life, at least he had offered them that. The realm was far from perfect, and further challenges would undoubtedly rise. But so, too, would Davos Seaworth, smuggler, knight, and king. Every morning, ready to bear those burdens as best he could. And for that, the Seven Kingdoms might yet remember him kindly long after the onion on his sigil had faded and rusted away in the annals of time.